Hello and welcome back to Morgan Mead Makes. This is day 2 of learning Photoshop in 7 days. In the previous episode, we learned how to use the pencil tool and the brush tool and some basic layers. Today we're going to be applying some filters, and as a bonus at the end I'm going to teach you a tool that I probably should have taught you yesterday. So let's get started. Alright, so previously we learned how to use the paintbrush and the pencil tools in Photoshop. I wanted to show you a couple more things before we move forward with filters. And that is, if you have a pressure sensitive pen like this, like a Huion tablet or a Wacom tablet, Photoshop loves those. And we can draw with those more naturally instead of holding this brick and trying to draw fine art with a brick. One really neat thing that Photoshop does is we can set the shape, the size of the actual brush that you're drawing with, or the opacity of the brush that you're drawing with to respond to the pressure of the pen. So right here I'm under the shape dynamics. I got to that by hitting this little folder icon on the toolbar. And if I just go to Control and tell it to use pen pressure, then what I get is a very small brush, and as I push harder and harder, the brush gets bigger and bigger. So it is responding to the pressure that I'm giving it. You can do some really cool effects with that. And let's turn that off, and I'll show you the same thing with transfer over here. Go to Control and pen pressure. And now you can see the purple inside of there is getting turned up as I go. Now I still have the stroke on for this layer, and that's why you see that. But it basically goes from invisible to this purplish blue because it's following the opacity of the pen pressure. Okay, so I just wanted to show you that because we will be using that in later episodes. Okay, so let's say we had this Pokeball knockoff from the other day, and we wanted to make this green. So we could draw this again, or we could just change it. There are a variety of different ways that we could change it. The first being, we go back to that layer styles panel that we saw. So we double click over here in the light gray, and under this layer styles we have one called color overlay. Now color overlay, we can just pick a new color, and this works great for solid objects like what we have right now. And we could just change it to whatever color we wanted, and it would overlay that color onto that layer. And it doesn't matter what the layer color is, it will always overlay green. So that's one way of doing it. But if we have transparency to our layer, let's go back and turn on our transparency. It still follows the transparency, which is pretty rad. Okay, I'm going to undo that, and I'm going to go back in here and uncheck that box and get rid of our color overlay. It is still listed here, and I've always thought that this is kind of weird, but what we can do is right click on this layer, and we can go to clear layer style, and that'll get rid of all the filters that are on that layer. Alright, so let's look at one more thing that we can do. We can go up to image and adjustments. This is where we can adjust some brightness and contrast. We can adjust the color in this second section here, and we can do a couple of weird effects right here in the third box. Let's look at this second box right here. So we've got vibrance, hue and saturation, color balance, black and white, photo filter, channel mixer, and color lookup. Let's take a look at hue and saturation. I think this is probably the easiest and most accessible. So it brings up this little panel, where we can hue shift the colors in that layer. Now remember, we have layer 2 selected. So I can just drag this little slider and you can see it keeps its lightness and saturation values and just changes the hue. That's actually kind of neat right there. Now I can change the saturation too, so I can desaturate it completely, meaning it's black and white or grayscale. And I can saturate it like crazy, giving it a really vibrant color. And I can change the lightness and darkness, which is basically you would think of it as like the brightness of it. So going all the way up to nearly white, all the way down to black. So we said we wanted it green. Let's go ahead and hue shift until we find green. There we go. And that's a little too vibrant for me, so I'm going to take the saturation down and probably even the lightness down just a little bit, just so it's kind of like a grass green color. And hit OK. Now you can see in the thumbnail image right here that our layer actually did change green. It's not just an effect that's applied over the top. And that's how we would do a simple color change. Now, we might run into problems if we had more complicated colors. This is cell shaded, it's just one big solid color, so it worked perfectly for us. Let's go on to something more complicated like a photo. I found a photo on the internet. All I did was Google world's most handsome man, and I came up with that. And I thought, yeah, that's a pretty great photo to work with here. There is a lot of extra space, and I want to just kind of focus a little bit more on the face area, so let's crop it in. I could hit C on the keyboard, or I can go to that fifth tool down, can't count today, and that's the crop tool. You can just drag the corners in until you get it cropped where you want it, which for me is going to be, I don't know, about right there, and hit the little check mark. That deletes out all the extra pixels that we didn't need. Control 0 zooms us to the document bounds. And let's take a look at that same hue and saturation and see what happens if I want to change my skin tone a little bit more red or tan. Okay, so I'm going to go up to Image, Adjustments, and Hue and Saturation. And let's just start wiggling this around, and you can automatically see, I'm going to go ahead and switch to the mouse. You can already see what it's doing here. It is changing the colors of everything in the whole image. Why? Because I don't have layers. It's all one layer, the background layer, and it's going to hue shift every pixel in that layer. Except for my shirt, because there's no color, there's no hue to my shirt. It's basically just a lightness value. So if I move the lightness, then I can change how light my shirt is. All right, so that's not going to work for us because I don't want everything in the image to hue shift. So this is where adjustment layers come in. Adjustment layers are just like layers, except for you don't have to paint anything on them. Not necessarily. There is a layer mask, but let's find out what that means. So down here next to our little add and delete layers, if we go over to the middle here, there is create new fill or adjustment layer. So I'm going to hit that, and I'm going to go to hue and saturation, because that's what we were looking for. Now it creates this layer with two icons on it. The first icon is the actual hue and saturation adjustment. That's whatever filter I'm applying right there. The second one is called the layer mask. This is controlling basically what pixels underneath of that filter are being affected. Confusing. Yeah, I know. Hang on. Let's adjust this first. Let's go back and readjust the hue and saturation, or just the hue. And you can see, again, it affects everything in the whole image. Well, that's because our mask right here, I'm going to click to select it, our mask is just white. Okay, the way a layer mask works is, we think of layers like layers of paper stacked up. Well, if you want to see the photo on the bottom layer and you stack a white piece of paper on top of it, which is what we did here, we can't see that photo, right? It covers the whole photo. If we want to see part of the image down below, we need to cut with scissors a hole out of that piece of paper so that we can see what's underneath of it. That's what a layer mask is. It's essentially just a hole in the paper so we can see what's down below. In this case, in the case of the adjustment layers, we're going to cut a hole where we want to see the original photo below, meaning where we want to see the original colors. It is a grayscale mask. Black meaning hole, and white meaning piece of paper. Okay, solid layer. So right now everything is white. We don't see any of the original pixels through that. We see everything through the lens of our hue and saturation. If we go to our trusty brush tool and we switch to black by hitting that little arrow or by hitting X on the keyboard, now we're going to paint with black. And let me just make sure I don't have my transfer on because I want this to be solid black. And wherever I paint, you're going to see the original colors down below. And you'll also see the layer mask thumbnail right here update. So you can see that I've got like a little black hole right in the middle where I scribbled. So let's undo that. I can make my brush size bigger with my square brackets, and I'm just going to paint right out here. And I'm going to be just a little bit sloppy with it because this is not a tutorial on painting background images. Okay, I'm going to do that. You know what? I'm going to do the shirt too. Helps to make noises. Okay, that's really sloppy. Did I mess up? Nope. Do I need the eraser? Nope. Layer masks are non-destructive, so what I can do is switch back over to white by hitting X on the keyboard. And now I'm going to paint inside my face with white just to kind of fix up where I got out of the lines a little bit. And you can do this as many times as you want. Just switch back and forth, white to black, white to black, white to black, and get it looking perfect. At no point are you ever locked into what you've painted. There is always adjustments that can be made with layer masks. So that is the beauty of the non-destructive nature of layer masks. If I was to do this with the eraser tool, on layer masks or on layers like this, it might work a little bit. But you always have the flexibility with layer masking to go back and fine tune and just really nitpick the edges like that. Okay, so now that I have my mask drawn and you can see the thumbnail there, it's white where my face, any of my skin tone and hair are, and black everywhere else. If I switch back over to that left side icon, the hue and saturation icon, now I can play with the sliders a little bit more and make myself look tan instead of blue. So let's push it a little bit red like that. Let's give ourselves a little space here. Boop. I can make it a little bit darker and maybe a little bit more saturated like that. And let's take a look at the difference it makes. So if I hit the little eyeball next to the layer, that turns it off. And then on, off, on. And you can see I got outside of the edges on my ear right there. But again, layer masking, I can just fix that by switching to black and just shaving it right off. Easy peasy, lemon squeezy. Okay, let's look at other filters that we can do just real quick. If I go up to the filter menu, easiest way to just experiment with filters is by going to the filter gallery right here. And it's going to show you a giant blown up version of whatever you're looking at. You can zoom out right here with these little buttons and just get it to where you need it and then pick a filter. So one filter that I really like is poster edges. That's kind of a cartoony filter. I'm going to play with the edge thickness here. and that is the black edges. Crank that up all the way. Edge intensity, maybe turn that down a little bit. And posterization, this is how many layers that I want. The more layers, the more realistic it looks. If I go all the way down, then it's a little too much, I think. So maybe keep it right there. I can switch to different filters here, add some that have like a texture to them, like the rough pastels or brush strokes. I like the crosshatch here. Let's turn up the strength of it. You can really see it down in the beard there. And you can stack these up too. So this is essentially a layers palette right here for the filters. And you can hit the plus button and you can add a filter on top of a filter. So this is the poster edges on top of the crosshatch. And sometimes they give you different results if you switch the order of them too. You can see that one did too. So my advice with filters is simply play around with them. You know, there's a ton in here. You can download more. These are just crazy filters that you can apply. Outside of the filter gallery, there are other filters down here below that you can do. Some important ones would be blur, the Gaussian blur. So if I give myself a Gaussian blur like that, now you are seeing a weird outline here, and that's because of this hue and saturation. I'm going to turn that off. So there's a blur. There's a few different kinds of blur that we can do. I'm going to keep this adjustment layer off for a minute. There's a motion blur that I think is really cool. You can give it an angle and a distance. I'll crank it up so you can really see the results. You know what, let's crank it up even further. This is good for adding blur effects on like race car photos and stuff like that. Make them look like they're zooming past. We can go to distort and add a weird pinch to my face. Man, my hair looks awesome. Let's see what else. Noise, we can add some noise, reduce some noise, add dust and scratches. Sometimes this one works, sometimes it doesn't. Some of these filters are definitely coded better than the others. Mosaic is kind of cool. It'll turn you into like, you know, floor tiles. So pixelate me. What else? Render. I'm just going to show you some of the more interesting ones, the standout filters. Lighting effects is pretty cool. So within lighting effects, you can kind of relight your photo. So I'm going to grab my light right here. I can move it around by clicking and dragging like this. And I can basically just kind of relight my scene. There's no icon to grab or anything like that. You just kind of click and drag inside the photo. And you just play around with it, you know? Just play around with it, see what the sliders do. I'm going to change the intensity here. Now there are different, if I grab right up where the light source is, for some reason I'm not seeing the actual widget that's supposed to be there, but if I just kind of hover around, I can see rotate and scale width, and I can just kind of adjust my light from there. Even give it a color if I want. So anyway, you get the idea. You can completely fake your lighting for the whole photo in that filter, which is pretty cool. Sharpen. I will give you one little piece of advice here. Sharpen doesn't work as well as you think, and a little bit goes a long way. The best way to get a sharp photo is to take a sharp photo. Don't take something with a little bit of blur thinking that you can just sharpen it in Photoshop. Doesn't really work that way. But if you do unsharp mask, you can crispen up the details a little bit, which is nice. But like I said, don't think that you can take a blurry photo and sharpen it up. It's not going to work. Some of these other filters we'll get into in later tutorials when we're doing very specific things, but I wanted to show you where they're at so that you can play. There are more over here under the image adjustments that you can check out. There's a different posterize right there and a threshold, which is really good at isolating parts of your image based on the values in the image. So that can come in handy as a utility to kind of feed into some layer blending modes and other filters that we'll get into again in a different tutorial. Oh, and as a bonus, one more thing before we get going. I didn't show you the fill bucket in episode 1, and I probably should have. I just want to show you the fill bucket real quick here. It's hidden under the gradient tool. If you hold in the arrow and go to fill bucket tool right there, fill bucket will fill in any enclosed shape that you have with a new color. So if I pick, this magenta color right here, I've got my green balls selected. If I just hover over it and I click one time, it'll fill those pixels in. If it was an open contour, it would not have filled that. It would have filled the entire image. I guess I could show you a very fast example. If I take black like this and I draw something that's, I think it's probably closed, but it's not. There's a little gap right there. You have to think of this fill bucket tool as spilling water or spilling paint. If I click here, it's going to fill the whole image because it escaped out of that little area right there. Now, if I was to take my brush tool and just close that up like that, and then take my paint bucket tool, G on the keyboard, now I click, now it stays within that design. So there are a few problems with it. If I zoom in here, if I was to make the outline with the brush tool, remember it has the very soft edges. That soft edge makes it very hard for the fill bucket to fill it exactly. So you get this weird kind of white ghosting outline effect. If I made that outline with the pencil, I would have better luck filling it in, as long as it was big enough to be solid, So just some things to consider. Okay, that's enough for episode 2. Practice what we just learned, let it soak in, and I'll see you tomorrow for episode 3.